Good evening, Rowan. It's the 16th of October 2016 and it's about 11:15. And obviously, I'm making you my usual Sunday evening video to reassure you that I haven't been seducing any priests over the weekend, so you can relax. You must be really relaxed now you realise I'm not going to be seducing any priests before you go to prison, even though obviously I'm going to be with my beloved the moment the door closes behind you. And we're really looking forward to being together because we're just so loved up and madly in love with each other, and we just can't wait to be in each other's arms. So anyway, following on from the video I made on Friday evening, where I talked about a talk that you gave at St Martin in the Fields on the 1st of October 2016, just to demonstrate once again how you just keep repeating the same old strategies over and over again, and that every time I say anything about you, like you're a psychopath and you can't learn, you then go and say something else or do something else, just to demonstrate that my assessment of you was absolutely spot on. So this video actually follows on from that. It's in the same vein, and it's another section from the question and answer session that you did when you were doing a series of lectures about Dietrich Bonhoeffer at an Episcopalian seminary in Tennessee in the last week of September 2016. And I already did one video about an answer that you gave there about the rise of nationalism all over the world. And so this question, actually the substance of the question and the substance of the answer are not so important. I'm just using this to illustrate your persistent tendency to evade taking responsibility for any bad actions of yours. So I've said before, and I've made videos about it before, how you've got highly developed strategies for evading criticism and any form of narcissistic injury. So I'm just taking this question now to illustrate that you're doing this, in fact, very blatantly in your answer to this question. So here's the question. You talked about the church as the integrity of society, and I'm curious about how Bonhoeffer's work might have related to William Temple's in that kind of call, and if they interacted at all. So that's the first part of the question, which took 15 seconds in the original video. So here's the second part of the question. And related perhaps if the Church's role of getting right its own ordering internally and how we reflect the kingdom of God, if that's enough to witness and to nudge society towards what it should be, I think he meant, or if there's more work to be done. And then he goes on, it seems so often we're overly eager to kind of engage society than we are to get our own ordering right. So there's the whole question, 46 seconds in total, 15 seconds, the first part of the question about Bonhoeffer and William Temple, 31 seconds, the second part of the question, which is about should the church get its own act in order before trying to engage society, or should it put more of a priority on that? I suppose that would represent it a bit better. So here's how you summarise the question immediately. Interesting question about Bonhoeffer and the tradition of William Temple. And then you go on to answer the question, but you don't mention the bit about the church getting its own act in order. So I'd just like to point out that the second part of the question took 67.4% of the time taken to ask the whole question. And your answer to the question lasts for 241 seconds, and 6 seconds of that were taken answering the second part of the question, which was 67.4% of the time taken to answer the question. And this is your answer to that part of the question. And so that puts the question back to the church. Are we doing that as a church? let's not answer that for the moment. So you took 6 seconds to say that, which is 2.5% of the whole time that you took to answer the question. So you took 2.5% of your answer to answer 67.4% of the question, and the only thing that you said was, let's not answer that for the moment. But you never come back to answer it at all, in fact. So you couldn't answer a question about the church putting its own house in order without reflecting over your own behaviour, could you? Because it's because of people like you that the church needs to put its house in order in the first place, because you're a very abusive man. You tell lies all the time. And not only that, it's not even that you just happen to be a bad apple in the church. You're not actually a member of the church in any real sense, because you're not a Christian. And you're an Illuminati shill. A shill is someone who appears to be working for one person or organisation, but is in fact working for another. So you're not even a member of the church. You're not a bad apple in the barrel that needs to be found and rooted out. You're not even a member of the church anyway. You're an infiltrator. You pretend that you're working for the church and working for Christian people and to promote Christianity and Christian values and this kind of thing, even though you invert them most of the time, and you generally promote Marxism and globalism and collectivism and call it Christianity. So you're not even a bad apple in the barrel. You just shouldn't even be in the barrel at all. You've infiltrated it. It's like you're some entirely different kind of fruit that's in there, that's gone a lot more rotten than any apple ever could. So that's another example of you, in this case, very blatantly evading any form of self-criticism or narcissistic injury, because you couldn't have answered that question without talking about your own role in the church being not in the good state it might be in, if it weren't for psychopaths like you, shall we say. So I'm just going to comment now on a couple of things that you say in this answer. I'm not going over it all, because I don't know a great deal about the subject matter about Bonhoeffer and William Temple. Anyway, William Temple was an Archbishop of Canterbury during the Second World War in the early part of the 1940s, and he died in office, and he promoted Christian socialism, I suppose you'd say. He wrote a book about it. So anyway, one of the things that you say in your answer to this question is, our responsibility is to build the responsibility of others. I think you said that's what Bonhoeffer said, but can't just remember now. But you seem to think your responsibility is to build the responsibility of others or in others, because you try to get other people like me to take responsibility for your evil deeds. You've talked in talking about Dostoevsky, which I've shown several times before now. You've referred to this quite a number of times over the last 18 months, about people making a contribution in an unjust world by taking the blame for something that they haven't done. So you seem to think that our responsibility to build the responsibility of others means you put all your responsibility for your personal evil deeds on other people. And if you can't do that successfully, then you just say, oh, well, it's because of the fallen corrupt world and the corrupt political order, and because other people are sinful. And I've made a video about this before. I've made at least 2 videos about this actually before, the most recent one being on the 23rd of May. So you do seem to think your responsibility is to make other people responsible for your actions. So you then say that there's been a change in the culture. You don't put it quite like this, but a change in the culture in Britain since Temple's day, which was during the Second World War. And you say, we have to argue our case. There isn't an assumption that the church is listened to as a moral voice. Well, as I've said before, the Anglican Church doesn't really have any authority, does it? Because there's no agreed doctrine. I suppose it would have had more moral authority in the 1940s, not just because more people would have identified themselves as Christian and as Anglican during that time, but I think there was a more general consensus about the basics of Christian morality within the Church of England back in the 1940s than there is now, when there's a lot of disagreements about various things. So the church really, if you're talking about the Church of England, it can't really have a moral voice, can it? Because Anglicans don't really agree about anything, and the Church of England doesn't have any agreed doctrine or ethics, really. And it also applies different ethics to clergy than it does to laity as well, which kind of undermines the absolute value of Christian morality if things are all right for some people and not for others. So it's all right. I mean, for quite a long time, I mean, it was all right in the Church of England if you were divorced and remarried, even though they didn't allow divorcees to remarry in the church officially. Still, some clergy would remarry divorcees, but then you couldn't be ordained if you were divorced and remarried. And then they've only recently changed that. And then even more recently than that, they changed the rule that you couldn't be a bishop if you'd been divorced and remarried, or you were married to someone that was divorced and remarried. So there's kind of hierarchies of morality in the Church of England, which kind of undermines the idea that Christian morality is absolute, or that there's absolute truth. If not everyone is expected to adhere to the same moral values. So you couldn't possibly say that the Church of England has a moral voice. And of course, the moral voice of individuals within the Church of England is undermined by scumbags like you, as it would be in any church or organisation anyway. It's harder to accept the moral voice of an institution when there are certain scumbags within it doing very evil things, like you, for example. Everyone seems to get tarred with the same brush. So, you also talk about Dietrich Bonhoeffer being involved with Bishop Bell as well. I've forgotten his first name just off the top of my head. But anyway, he was around during the Second World War as well. He was in the House of Lords and he was constantly condemning carpet bombing of areas in Germany. He said this was very immoral, particularly attacking, murdering, in fact, women and children who weren't involved in the Nazi regime. And he thought this was very immoral, and that if Britain was supposed to be having a moral role in a war against the Nazis, then it shouldn't be targeting civilians like this. So that's what Bishop Bell was saying. You do mention him, and I think some people thought he would have been made Archbishop of Canterbury, except Winston Churchill hated him because he was constantly criticising his war strategy. But anyway, he was friends with Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and he met with him. And he knew about the resistance in Germany to Hitler and to the Nazi regime. And Bishop Bell was arguing that Britain should be more supportive of the German resistance and their attempts to remove Hitler. But of course, that wasn't the purpose of the war, was it, to remove Hitler? So perhaps that might be a reason why the British government never went along with that. And Winston Churchill is always heralded as some great hero in the Second World War, even though he was really a war criminal, and he spent most of his time drunk. And he also wrote quite a lot of anti-Semitic articles in the 1920s as well, and he's very well remembered for his rousing speech, we will fight them on the beaches and we'll fight them on the landing fields. And of course he wasn't fighting anyone anywhere, he was in London, in a bunker about 80 feet under the ground of Downing Street, half drunk most of the time. So I'm not a great admirer of Winston Churchill, and I think Lady Astor really should have poisoned his coffee. And he was a war criminal. And I think that the bombing of civilians in Germany was intended to make Hitler retaliate, because British people weren't involved in the war really. They didn't support the war because it wasn't happening in Britain. Germany wasn't bombing Britain. And so Churchill decided to start bombing civilians in Germany to provoke Hitler to retaliate. And when he did that, then British people saw him as a bad person. He's, attacking civilians and this kind of thing. I mean, Hitler was a bad person. I'm not saying that he wasn't, but he was provoked into bombing civilians in Britain by Winston Churchill, who started it first and is in fact a war criminal. They say history is written by the victors, and everybody seems to have forgotten that in relation to the Second World War. And also, Bishop Bells had some allegations of child abuse made against him relatively recently and a long time after he died. And I don't know how substantiated these arguments are. So he may have been Archbishop of Canterbury instead of William Temple, except Winston Churchill hated him because he was constantly criticising his war strategy and telling him not to bomb civilians in Germany. So that's all I'm going to say about that this evening, because I only really wanted to make the point that this is another example of you using one of your usual strategies. You have highly developed strategies for evading criticism and narcissistic injury, and you couldn't answer that man's question because it would have involved reflecting on your own behaviour and the situation that you're in, and that's why you didn't answer it. Even though you said you were leaving it for the moment, you never came back to it. So that's the end of my video for this evening. I might say a word about my beloved later on, but I may not. But don't forget to be alert, because I will be turning up to arrest you. And don't worry, there's plenty more shit to be getting through, even if you never utter another word of shit again in your entire life. But your bullshit seems to be escalating, if anything. So I'm rather optimistic you're going to come out with something else that's hilarious in the very near future. Hasta la próxima.
You talked about the church as the integrity of society, and I'm curious about how Bonhoeffer's work might have related to William Temple's in that kind of call, and if they interacted at all.
Sorry, how it might relate
to William Temple, and related perhaps if the church's role of getting right its own ordering internally and how we reflect the kingdom of God, if that's enough to witness and to nudge society towards it should be, or if there's more work to be done. Because it seems so often we're overly eager to kind of engage society than we are to get our own ordering right.
Thank you. Thank you. Interesting question about Bonhoeffer and the tradition of William Temple. I think that one of the things that's fascinatingly going on in Temple's career is a move away from a particular kind of Edwardian social meliorism, a sort of rather top-down approach, to a deeper involvement with what was to become the philosophy of the welfare state in the late 40s, a vision which sadly has become something very different from what it was intended to be. I think Temple would entirely have agreed with Bonhoeffer that our responsibility is to build the responsibility of others. And one would not call his social philosophy welfarism in the derogatory sense. He's about building a strong society. So I think that there'd be a lot of crossover there. Temple, of course, was Archbishop of Canterbury at a time when the British ruling elite was still fairly small and fairly cohesive a lot of the time. Temple had access to people in decision-making circles, and so the presence of the church in the social discussion after the Second World War was quite an influential one. Temple really does have a part in the Beveridge Report and the reforms of Clement Attlee's government. We've moved a long way. The ruling elite is far less cohesive. The church has far less leverage within it. And we have to work a lot harder to argue our case. There isn't an assumption that the church is listened to as a moral voice. I'm talking about the UK. So how we do this, how we try to pursue that argument in the public sphere, is by no means clear. I think we have to try and do it. We have to remember that we don't have an automatic right to be heard or agreed with, but we do need some coherent pictures of what human flourishing and human solidarity look like, and those need to be theologically informed. We need, in other words, to move beyond a social witness which just says we'd better be kind to the unfortunate, and to say we need a vision of society in which our commitment to building up each other's strength all the time, each other's resource, robustness, capacity for agency, that's what we want, and that's what the image of the body of Christ is all about. And so that puts the question back to the church: are we doing that as a church? Let's not answer that for the moment, but that's what we're there for. But the Temple parallel is a really interesting one. And of course Bonhoeffer's own engagement with and encounter with the Church of England in the 30s was very, very significant. Not only the relationship with Bishop Bell, which was so important, but also his visits to the religious communities at Mirfield and Kelham, and his exposure in the 30s to that particular brand of rather Anglo-Catholic Christian socialist that is broadly reformist and justice-oriented action that was woven into the lives of those communities. So I like to think that the Church of England, oddly enough, had just a little bit of input into Bonhoeffer's vision, and it did certainly give him some concrete pictures to work with of what intentional Christian community looked like.
Don't try to change me, you're wasting your time. Now I got something much better in mind. Robert De Niro's waiting, talking Italian. You bring me alive. He's a bad, bad boy. I'm a bad, bad girl. And we're getting mad.
This is why Catholics have the best sex.
Adelante.